Hello students, I am Radhika Chitkara and I work for a women's rights organization. Through the course of the last module, we discussed the manner in which human rights are traditionally limited to the public sphere. The public sphere understood in two senses. First, in relation to the actors, where the state is treated as a public actor and every other entity is treated as a private actor. And second, in terms of the context, in which the realms of governance, of polity and of economics are treated as the public spheres of life, whereas the realms of the family, the home and the community are treated as the private spheres of life. In this module, we will proceed in two segments. First, we will analyze the political relevance of the public-private divide in the marginalization of women from the ambit of human rights. And in the second segment, we will analyze the use of rights talk as a cultural ethic that provides for the effective attainment of human rights of women. The exclusion of women's experiences from the paradigm of human rights has been analyzed through two lenses. One approach suggests that human rights law is inherently not universal because it excludes the experiences of women within the private sphere or even within the public. The second stream of thought suggests that human rights law does address the private, but uses the public-private divide as a shield to not address the issues of women. We first discuss the meaning of the lack of universality of human rights. Hilary Charlesworth suggests that human rights in themselves are the creation of a patriarchal epistemic order. Human rights as universal and inalienable inherent rights of an individual against the state, this conception of human rights inherently excludes the experiences of women, which leads us to question whether the rights themselves are actually universal. We know that human rights instruments are written in a gender-neutral manner. So, on the face of it, they seem to apply to both men and women equally. Not only is the language gender-neutral, human rights instruments also expressly prohibit any kind of discrimination on the basis of sex. But nevertheless, these instruments, by prioritizing civil and political rights, and the specific enumeration of the rights within these instruments, accord primacy to forms of oppression that are faced by men. They exclude private violations of dignity which are normally faced by women and persons with alternative sexualities. But why is this? This is because traditionally the sphere of the private is construed as the sphere of love and affection, where bonds of kinship and concern regulate relationships between individuals. The private is created as the realm of safety, where individuals can take refuge from the animosity of the world within the public sphere. And in that sense, the private is imagined to be a sanctuary. But all of this is contested by decades of studies that reveal that women are most likely to face violence within the confines of the private and within the confines of the home. And it is mostly men that experience violence within the public sphere. By excluding these specific forms of violence that women generally face from the ambit of the human rights paradigm, Charlesworth suggests that human rights are actually not universal, but are the rights of men. Burroughs and Gare add a further layer to this analysis. They look at human rights as a masculine order. They argue that men and women are different in biology and in society, that due to the attribution of different roles to them within society, they are often not treated equally. So, when human rights instruments employ the language of neutrality, they elide the differences, be it through biology or through society, between men and women. And therefore, what the human rights instruments do is to protect women from violations that men might typically face, even as they exist in the public sphere. Women are not protected qua women. So, for instance, for the longest time, international human rights law excluded rape and sexual violence as means of perpetrating torture upon individuals. Because these forms of violence, even as they exist in the relationship of an individual with this state, are specifically perpetrated upon women. So, a masculine human rights order does not accord for this specific kind of violation that is perpetrated upon women, but recognizes general forms of violence perpetrated against the physical body anyway. It is at this stage that Burroughs and Gare also mount a critique on this CEDAW, which is classically hailed to be the text upholding the human rights of women. They state that CEDAW instates the privileges and the opportunities accorded to men as the norm and as the ideal. And only in areas where women are denied that kind of equality with men does the CEDAW seek to address those shortcomings. It does not address the specific experiences of women de novo. To overcome the challenge of the lack of universality of human rights and the manner in which they exclude and marginalize women, Bunch suggests that they must be reimagined as not merely civil and political rights, but also as economic, social and cultural rights. Because a majority of the life experiences of women lie at the intersection of the economy, society and culture, as opposed to the civil and political realm. These include increasing access to resources, to healthcare, to education, to employment. And it is for these reasons also that Barbara Stark uphails the International Convention on the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights as a postmodern feminist text. Not only because it addresses the specific experiences of women within the realm of society and culture, but also because they recognize the need for compensatory measures and special treatment for women to be able to gain equality. They prioritize action or positive affirmative action over inaction, which is merely a negative obligation. The second kind of analysis normally undertaken to explain the exclusion of women from the human rights paradigm is the arbitrariness of the public-private dichotomy. Authors argue, such as Charlesworth, Chinkin and Wright argue, that the state regulation of the private sphere is not inviolate, and that the public-private dichotomy is irrational and inconsistently applied. In their eyes, the exclusion of the private sphere from state regulation is a myth and an ideological construct, and not necessarily something that translates in practice. So, there are three reasons that justify this analysis. First, the creation of the private sphere of non-intervention on behalf of the state is in itself an act of the state which delineates the public and the private sphere. These spheres have no a priori existence without a definition accorded to them by the state. Secondly, anyway, through legislations and through other kinds of laws, states regularly and consistently regulate the private sphere through laws on marriage, on inheritance. Even taxation has an incidental impact on the regulation of private matters. Laws regulating marriage, for instance, might suggest a heterosexual norm of marriage by which only a man and a woman can marry. By not imagining a scenario of homosexual relationships, the state is entering into the realm of the private sphere while retaining a facade of non-intervention. And thirdly, that there are several kinds of bodily violations and violations of dignity and autonomy that human rights does outlaw. For instance, slavery, cannibalism, all of which are relationships between individuals inter se and not between the state and the individual. For human rights law to then take the excuse that the otherwise private matter of the home is not something to be intervened with is fallacious in the face of these interventions. But Karen Engel analyzes the private-public divide through a different lens. She analyzes that the divide is not entirely oppressive, and that the continuous deployment of the distinction in strategizing for women's rights has the effect of constraining women themselves. This has three problematic impacts. First, it reifies the two spheres and concretizes them in their isolated spheres of existence, as if there is a definite public sphere and a definite private sphere, where the public sphere is occupied by men and the private sphere is occupied by women. It neglects the public lives of women when they do participate outside of the home and outside of the community. Second, this constant imagination of the private sphere as a sphere of oppression neglects the role that it can play in emancipating women and the LGBT community. For instance, it is the right to privacy that has been deployed in debates pertaining to abortion and in LGBT rights that has enabled women and persons of alternative sexualities to regain control over their own bodies and their decisions without the intervention of the state. Third is the allegation of Eurocentrism and the complicated relationship that feminism shares with culture. This is because in classic feminist analysis, culture is imagined to be a space within the private sphere, which consistently oppresses women. But this neglects the difference, the personal and subjective identification that women may themselves have with their culture and cultural practices. By viewing the cultural space merely as a space for oppression of the other woman, of the woman in post-colonial societies, of the women in Muslim states, of the women in other third world countries, it promotes a view of Eurocentrism that neglects the specific identities that women belonging to different castes, classes, religions, races may themselves feel with their culture. But even as human rights can be claimed for the emancipation of women, formally, what impedes their access to a life of dignity? By this we move into the second module, which is why is it that even with the formal grant of human rights to women, is their emancipation still not attained? With this we analyze Radhika Kumaraswamy's argument that the denial of human rights to women is not necessarily due to a shortcoming in the law or the formal processes of the state, but due to an ideological resistance to rights talk, for women specifically, that societies and cultures mount. The effectiveness of the human rights paradigm is contingent upon a cultural and political internalization of the rights ethic when it comes to women. Whereas in the current paradigm, human rights flow from above, from international and national norms, from the state, instead of experiencing internalization within the community and the family itself. So this leads to a situation of immense friction between the formal systems of law and authority and the informal systems of law and authority that women otherwise occupy, such as the community. We use Ashish Nandi's analysis of the post-colonial nation state and its interface with modernity to understand this interaction better. Ashish Nandi posits that the nation state exercises its authority over its subjects through the use of law under the garb of modernity and to overcome the irrationality of tradition. When in actuality, tradition in post-colonial nation states is quite autonomous from the law in itself. So for instance, in large sections of society and in different areas, it is highly likely that the law is less authoritative than the communal norms that the community develops on its own. Unless the rights paradigm pervades into these communal norms that are developed autonomously by the community, that impacts and affects the tradition itself, human rights for women cannot be actively attained. This leads to a massive friction between the formal systems of law and authority and the informal systems of authority that women generally occupy. We use Ashish Nandi's analysis of the post-colonial modern state and its interface with modernity to explain this phenomenon better. Ashish Nandi argues that the nation state exercises its authority over its subjects through the use of law under the garb of modernity and rationality, and to the exclusion of the irrational traditions that these subjects might otherwise be governed by. But as we have seen in most post-colonial nation states, tradition and culture often has an autonomous life of its own, quite independent from the diktats of the law. Most of you would be familiar with the concept of honor killings, for instance. These are sometimes perpetrated through ordinances promulgated by local caste panchayats, which punish transgressions of the notions of honor residing within the caste and within the community, when women elect to marry men of another caste. The punishment for this transgression might be through any kind of humiliation or violation of the man and the woman both. This could be through death, this could be through rape and sexual abuse, this could be through beheading or complete exclusion from participation in the community and the resources within the community. So even while intercaste marriages might be permitted by the law, even while such violations of the bodily integrity of the man and the woman involved are considered grave offences under the formal justice mechanisms, the panchayats themselves and the community themselves reject these notions, as the law is considered to be an imposition from the outside, and the tradition is something that is evolved indigenous to the community and relates more closely to the circumstances of the community. This makes it difficult for the human rights paradigm to pervade from the formal system of law and authority into the paradigm of traditions. Until it can enter this paradigm of tradition and culture, it will be difficult for women to fully realize their human rights. So as Annaim suggests, the effective human rights implementation for women, the rights talk must be translated into tradition talk as well. And he gives the example of several Islamic countries which have a better track record of attaining the human rights of women when they are advocated through the language of the Sharia and the Islamic law itself. Engelmary further analyzes the interface of tradition, culture, indigenous forms of thinking and human rights by looking at the women's inheritance movement in Hong Kong in 1994. She argues that in circumstances where the human rights ideology is not indigenous and is perceived to be alien, human rights norms can at best supplement and not supplant tradition. So for instance, when several women in Hong Kong complained of the deprivation of the inheritance rights to their father's property in 1994, they claimed that it was a personal wrong that was perpetrated by their own relatives and by their own kins by excluding these women from the property of their father. They did not imagine it as a violation of equal rights to inheritance between sons and daughters. Most notably, these protests arose not out of a challenge to the right of the son to inherit the father's property, but only when distant relatives claimed a superior right to the property than the daughters of the fathers themselves. For these women, the failure of the law was a failure of kinship bonds and not human rights. It was the task of local translators to use these claims, translate them into the language of human rights, and couch them as a right to equality issue and not necessarily as a personal wrong that has been perpetrated by the relatives of the daughter upon the daughter. Once this translation takes place, women began to view themselves through the double subjectivity of human rights on the one hand, as subjects of human rights on the one hand, as well as the subjects of culture on the other hand. And they were simultaneously claiming those property rights through those twin paradigms. This classically illustrates how human rights norms for women cannot stand on their own and do not stand on their own, but must be supplanted by an acceptance, an ideological acceptance within the cultural norms that women otherwise live under. In strategizing for the attainment of these human rights for women, it is important to keep in mind this act in translation. So, over the course of this module, we have addressed two distinct questions. We have addressed first, what is the political relevance of the public-private divide, such that the experiences of women are excluded from the human rights paradigm and there are scant redress for violations of their dignity. And secondly, how can human rights be actively attained for the benefit of women when there might be ideological resistance to it? We analyzed two streams of thought within the first question. The first suggested that the human rights paradigm is inherently gendered and structured in a manner that affirmatively excludes the experiences of women. And this is because it is defined in a manner that human rights actively sits only in the public domain. In this way, the experiences of women cannot be included within the paradigm unless human rights themselves come to be redefined. The second stream of thought suggested that the human rights paradigm is not inherently antagonistic to the rights of women, but carries the tools to include the experiences of women within the paradigm itself, and that currently women are excluded not because of a shortcoming of human rights themselves, but because they have not been read correctly to include the experiences of women. In the second question, we also understood how to extend the human rights paradigm to women. It is important to view them not merely as civil and political rights, but also as socio-economic and cultural rights, because that is where the predominant experience of women's lives resides. As part of the second question, we analyzed how traditions and cultures will continue to resist right stock when it comes to the emancipation of women. And unless women's rights advocates are able to translate human rights into local traditions and cultures, it will be difficult for the full implementation and realization of women's rights themselves. Thank you.